We're joined today by author Gary Graff, and we're talking about his latest book, 501 Essential Albums of the 1980s. Gary, how's it going today?
All right, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you for the opportunity.
Well, Gary, you've got the new book out here, 501 Essential Albums of the 1980s. Can you tell the listeners a bit about the new book?
Sure, it is. It's a sequel to the 501 Essential Albums of the 90s. And yeah, the title's pretty self-explanatory. What we set out to do was look at the decade in music and pick those essential albums, those titles that really define it. That if you were talking to somebody about the 1980s in music, which we know is a huge, huge decade in music, and tell them this, be able to hand them something and say, this is what it's about. This is the stuff you need to know about from that decade. That's what we set out to do with the book. Crazy exercise, because 501 seems like a large number when you first agree to do it, and then when you create a spreadsheet of about 2,500 potential titles, it's then the daunting task is just the obvious, to knock it down from 2,500 to the 501.
Yeah, daunting was what I was thinking as well. I know you had some people help you put the book together, but it seems like just sitting down with a blank piece of paper, I mean, this book could maybe take an entire decade itself just to put together.
It could, it didn't. One of the things that helped was we did the 90s book and the 80s book kind of back to back. So we were well practiced, if you will, that, by the time we got to the 80s book. And I even when we were in the thick of the 90s book, I had started the spreadsheet for the 80s book. So we were a little bit ahead of the game, but, it's still like the 90s book. It engendered a lot of discussion among the contributors, the other writers, and I use the word discussion euphemistically. They were passionate discussions, and people, like any popular culture, people have a real passion and a real tie to certain things, and in the case of music, to certain artists, to certain albums. And so there was a lot of back and forth, as much, if not more, about the 80s as there was for the 90s book, and very thoughtful. All the people who write, the contributors are generally, they're also music journalists, or they're academic people or creative types. So, there was a lot of thoughtful discussion about, first of all, what do we mean by essential? And then which ones are the essential albums?
And I imagine your personal taste would come in as well. I mean, so many different genres and styles were on the top of the charts, at one time or another, with rap and heavy metal and new wave. I mean, the 80s were really all over the place musically.
They really were. The 90s in some ways were even more so, but I think the 80s is where we became indoctrinated to being all over the place musically. I've taken to saying, I've been talking about the book a lot, that the 80s offered us this brief kind of shining period where we were all music fans because of things like MTV, and radio was not quite as segmented as it would become, although it was starting to segment. And we did have our tribes. You had your rock fans, your pop fans, your rap fans, so on and so forth. But there was, in the 80s, there was this greater consensus of what was important and what people understood to be popular than we've had at any other time, I think, in our point of popular culture history. So, let's say even if you weren't in Prince's tribe, you weren't a Prince fan, you knew who he was, and you knew you knew he was out there, probably knew what a few of his songs were, and you understood that this was a popular, important artist. Didn't matter if you liked him or not. We had consensus about Prince and Michael Jackson and Madonna and Bruce Springsteen and, REM to a degree, and Talking Heads, and, so many of the artists. And that was a very rare moment that I don't think we've ever, that's been rarely repeated. It happened during the 60s, certainly with the Beatles, and it happened during the 2010s and early 2020s with Taylor Swift. But we
Sure.
haven't had it at the magnitude that we had it during the 80s.
Again, Gary Graff is with us, and we're talking about the new book, 501 Essential Albums of the 1980s. I would say to the listeners out there, you really did your homework with this book. It's not just the name of the album and maybe a picture of the cover. I mean, you're really adding a lot of context into the album and the artist and the songs, and really, it's kind of like a history book in that way.
Thank you for saying that. And yeah, that is the point of it. We are trying to give people that context and that information where, everybody who wrote, including myself, the challenge was tell me why. Why was this an essential album? My case, it helped. I mean, I was there reporting in real time on these things as they came out. So it was a great trip down memory lane in a lot of ways, remembering being at Live Aid, remembering getting that first Duran Duran album, remembering when Thriller came in the mail, or 1999 or Purple Rain, remembering when I had hair for that matter. But so there was that really, and I was on the ground in the 90s too, but I guess the 80s when you're younger and the kind of decade the 80s won, there was a lot of smiling that went on with this book. I think with everybody who contributed to this book, because we all had some very visceral experiences of living through that decade and working through that decade and writing about these things when they first came out. And so revisiting them was really a sweet experience.
And for me, I like that you mentioned the mega stars that kind of dominated the 80s, Prince and Madonna, Michael Jackson, but they're all in there, of course, but there's a lot of other albums, by bands that were also great. And, maybe they kind of got lost in the shuffle a bit over the years. So it was kind of cool to see some things I had forgotten about and also some things I actually missed the first time around.
Yeah, and that again, we certainly hope that's the case. I hope, somebody reads about Beat Happening, and goes down that rabbit hole. Even something like Steve Van Zandt, Little Steven from Bruce Springsteen's E Street Band, forming the Disciples of Soul and releasing Men Without Women, which is a very, very personal favorite album of mine. If we can turn people onto that. And then some of the other things, the gospel albums, the blues albums, the jazz albums that don't necessarily come to mind when we're thinking about the MTV saturated 80s. But if the book can help steer people in that direction, then we've certainly done our job.
I know when a lot of people think of the 80s, they think of, I guess, what you would call one-hit wonders. Was that tough at all to kind of sift through all those artists who maybe they had an all-time classic song, but it was probably stuck on an album where the rest of it maybe was kind of lackluster?
Yeah, and there was a lot of that, and that really, that really was the litmus test. That something like the one that comes to mind quickly is Men Without Hats, the Safety Dance. Okay, fine. Or Modern English, I Melt With You, and the rest of those albums were okay, but they were just okay and not essential. We may call those, if this was 501 essential songs of the 80s, then we're having the discussion. But if it's albums, then no, with the album, had to be an essential listen from start to finish. So and there were a few conversations about that. I remember when the contributor who wrote the Till Tuesday entry, and obviously Voices Carry was the huge hit from there. And, he came to me and said, are we sure about this as an album? And I said, yeah, we are, because in addition to having that song, it also introduced the world to and established the career of Amy Mann, who is one of our more important songwriters and continues to have a vital career to this day. So those were the kind of discussions we had to have, and to separate, like you say, separating the wheat from the chaff is part of the endeavor. It's a lot of hair metal bands that we had to sift through. And,
Oh, sure.
say, yeah, okay, we like that Rat song, but the album, not so much. And now I've made every Rat fan very angry.
Well, Gary, I know when we spoke last about the 90s book, I mentioned this to you, but really in the 80s, one of my favorite parts of that decade was the movie soundtrack, and, really became huge business. And a lot of times the soundtrack even became bigger than the movie itself. A lot of times it was better than the movie that it represented.
Oh, and we had, listen, in the 80s, we had, The Breakfast Club, 16 Candles, Dirty Dancing. Yeah, there were so many. There were so many of them, more even than in the 70s. It really was, in the 70s, it really was Saturday Night Fever that woke both the music and movie industries up to the potential symmetry between and complementary relationship that could exist between the music and the movies, and how they could both work to promote each other to the benefit of each other. So you did have monster soundtracks, and yeah, some of them did do better, or at least would have been longer lasting than the movies themselves. But those movies are also longer lasting in our consciousness because of the success of the soundtrack.
Sure.
And this year we celebrated, what was it, the 40th anniversary of Don't You Forget About Me, Simple Minds, and The Breakfast Club, and and then also Back to the Future and The Power of Love. So, very important relationship. That does continue to this day, although I'm hard pressed to think of a soundtrack album from the last 20 years that had the kind of impact that we're talking about now.
Sure. Well, I got to ask you, you've done the 80s and the 90s. Will the series continue here? Will we see the 70s or the early aughts maybe coming up?
Certainly my hope, if all the good people listening to this go out and buy their 80s, 90s books, that will help us get to the other decade. The 70s is the next one on my radar to want to do. We've already started that spreadsheet. That's another potent decade, another one that's going to be hard to choose. I mean, tell me which Led Zeppelin album do you leave out of that book, right? And there were so many others. So I think, and the 60s, certainly a potent album decade, and the aughts, the first 10 decades of this century. I think there are good books to be had in both of those. So, hopefully it's really the publisher's call. Not that I don't ask them about it twice a day, but because I really do want to keep this going, and I really want to get into the 70s and then the other decades.
Excellent. Yeah, hopefully that works out. I've enjoyed the book so far, and I know 501 Essential Albums of the 80s just out here, Gary. Is there anything else maybe that you're working on, or another project outside of the album series?
Well, there is constant writing. That I continue to do daily journalism that you can find at Gary Graff on Music on Facebook, Graff on Music on X, Real Graff on Music on Instagram. That keeps me busy. And there is another book in the works that has not been announced yet. Same publisher. And it's kind of revisiting something I did before in a new way, and that's the most I should really say about it. It's not that it's earth shaking in its caginess, but it just hasn't been announced yet. So I should adhere to that for the time being. But that should be out in, I think we're looking at 27 for that.
Okay, excellent. Well, we'll keep an eye on that. And again, the 501 Essential Albums of the 1980s is out. Definitely a great book. And if you've got the 90s one, you're going to need the 80s one as well. Gary, it's always great speaking with you. I appreciate the time, and I hope we can do it again soon.
Thanks so much for having me again.
Again, that was author Gary Graff. His latest book, 501 Essential Albums of the 1980s, is out now.